At the turn of the millennium, the global airline industry was booming. Fleets were growing, alliances were forming, and new technology was making flying easier and more efficient than ever. US legacy carriers, American, United, Delta, Northwest, Continental, all reported strong profits. Europe's big dogs, British Airways, Lufthansa, and Air France, were also humming along quite nicely. But like in any industry, there are always losers.
We will change and evolve, or we will fall by the wayside. Clearly, we must change. With this vision as our roadmap, we now have a way to know where we are going and how to get there.
So yeah, clearly in the US, TWA lost their way, and things weren't looking too good for US Airways either. In Europe, Swissair and Sabena were massively over-levered and on the verge of collapse. In South America, the once unstoppable Varig and Vaspi had accumulated billions in debt and were about to run themselves into the ground. Over in Pakistan, PIA was also on the struggle bus. Once a profit-generating machine, Pakistan's flag carrier had developed a series of problems through the 90s that finally hit it hard in 1999. The government-run company lost 900 million rupees in 1999 and 2.8 billion in the year 2000. Competition and ballooning costs were the primary drivers. But Pakistan as a whole was also experiencing some serious economic issues. GDP grew very slowly during the 1990s, and inflation massively outpaced wage gains, making life very difficult for the country's working class, the civil servants, the industrial workers, the teachers. Consider this, in 1990, 20 rupees got you $1. In 2000, 20 rupees got you just 37 cents. That spells trouble, not just for ordinary people, but also for businesses and the government, both of which were relying heavily on foreign investment to remain afloat. Pakistan's government had borrowed a ton of money during the 1990s to fund chronic budget deficits. They weren't bringing in enough tax revenue to cover their ongoing expenses, which had skyrocketed. Nuclear testing in 1998 angered Western governments, who basically froze all loans and aid. Conflict with India and a coup in 1999 scared away any other foreign investors who were still there, and by 2000, Pakistan was in some serious trouble. The country's debt had risen to over 3 trillion rupees, exceeding its nominal GDP at the time. Its foreign exchange reserves had dipped to under 50 billion rupees, equal to only 1 month of imports. The government needed cash, fast. Most of this cash was provided by an IMF bailout, but one of the other ways it proposed raising money was by selling some of its large-scale public enterprises, one of those being PIA. So the government tried to sell a part of the airline, but no one really wanted to buy it. PIA's finances were in shambles, and their fleet was in pretty poor condition. In addition, the unions were against privatization because they feared it would mean job cuts, wage cuts, benefit cuts, all the things private investors might do to right-size the workforce and control labor costs. As such, the process was unsuccessful, and the government seriously considered shutting down the airline. However, after much persuasion from the airline's management, the government ultimately decided to give PIA another chance. They injected 20 billion rupees and installed a new managing director, a man named Ahmad Saeed. Saeed was a personal friend of Musharraf with zero experience in aviation. But hear me out, he did have an impressive resume. He graduated with a degree in chemical engineering, served as head of the Agricultural Development Bank under the Bhutto regime, then transitioned to the private sector, where he led a 7,000-employee shoe manufacturer. PIA would be his toughest challenge yet. He had to do a lot with very little cash: modernize the fleet, trim underperforming routes, improve PIA's brand image, all while keeping the unions at bay. Pilots at the time were demanding pay increases of 50 to 80%, whereas management could only offer them 10%. And as if that wasn't hard enough, he also had to deal with the fallout from 9/11. Neighboring Afghanistan quickly turned into a war zone, forcing Pakistan to close 7 of its airports. 29 foreign airlines ended scheduled services to Pakistan and closed their offices in the country. PIA had less competition on its international routes, so it actually maintained solid load factors, but it had to avoid Afghan airspace on flights to the US and UK, making flights longer and more expensive. This whole situation forced PIA to act with urgency and speed. The combination of corporate discipline from Mr. Saeed and his management team, as well as government help, mostly in the form of debt relief and cash injection, enabled PIA to return to profitability in 2002. This tangible evidence of a turnaround helped PIA secure financing for the largest aircraft order in its history. That was 8 Boeing 777 aircraft worth around $1.8 billion at list prices. Notably, PIA was the first airline to order all 3 passenger models of the 777, and they were the launch customer for the 777-200LR in 2006. This order was expensive, yes, but PIA needed to invest in its fleet. The 777s were more fuel efficient, offering up to 25% less fuel burn per seat than the A310s and 747-200s, and they also offered longer range, enabling PIA to serve North America non-stop. However, in practice, Toronto was the only North American destination that PIA actually served non-stop. The US didn't trust security protocols in Pakistan, so they made PIA stop at approved European gateways, such as Birmingham and Manchester, where passengers and baggage would be re-screened before proceeding to the US. It was a bit of a logistical headache, but it still worked from an operational and commercial standpoint. PIA could pick up connecting traffic in the UK, which had the largest Pakistani population in Europe, at about 1.5 million. As such, the carrier was able to operate routes to New York, Chicago, and Houston, all at various points during the 2000s. With the new 777s came a new livery. The full name Pakistan was replaced by just PIA on the forward fuselage, and the tail got a Pakistani flag. It was very plain, but decidedly more modern and international. To spice things up, PIA did introduce a number of special liveries. These planes featured distinct motifs on the tail representing different provinces across the country. At the end of 2004, PIA seemed to be on a clear path towards improvement. They had reported profits for 3 years straight. They had better management and more reliable operations. The political situation was stable. Tensions with India had eased, and PIA had re-established a direct air link with its neighbor for the first time since 2002. Deputy MD Niaz Hussain proclaimed that PIA would soon reach the same standard as Singapore, Emirates, and other reputed international airlines. And hey, I like the optimism, but that statement might have been a little premature. Between 2004 and 2006, the price of gas went up 72%, and PIA's total fuel bill doubled. Unlike other airlines, it did not hedge its fuel, so it absorbed 100% of all the cost increases. The average age of the fleet was 20 years old. Keep in mind that while PIA was starting to receive new 777s, most of the fleet still consisted of older generation 737s, 747s, A310s, and Fokkers. And these planes were not very fuel efficient. Fuel as a percentage of total revenue sat at 47%, ridiculously high compared to other airlines. Not to mention, PIA had taken on over $1 billion in loans to buy new 777 and ATR aircraft. These loans, of course, came with interest expense, and this expense line had more than doubled since 2004. And it gets worse. In 2006, one of the airline's Fokkers crashed, killing all 45 on board. The crash was attributed to a combination of poor maintenance procedures and pilot error, so basically the blame was squarely on PIA as an organization. All remaining 6 Fokker aircraft were grounded, resulting in considerable lost revenue, and the airline spent millions of rupees checking planes, implementing new safety procedures, and retraining pilots. The net result was an 8.6 billion rupee operating loss in 2006, a 10.5 billion rupees swing from 2 years prior. And I really wish I could say there was another turnaround in the works, but things only got worse. The Great Recession hit PIA particularly hard, mostly as a result of the massive spike in oil prices in 2008, along with massive levels of inflation that saw the Pakistani rupee lose about 20% of its value in just 1 year. Peter, why does the value of the rupee matter? We've covered this in prior videos, but I think it's important to reiterate. Almost all of PIA's loans were issued by the US Import-Export Bank and were denominated in US dollars. However, PIA holds most of its cash in rupees because it is required to do so as a Pakistani government-owned enterprise. When PIA goes to pay off its debt, it has to convert rupees to dollars. So when the rupee loses value against the dollar, PIA's effective debt balance goes up even if it doesn't take on any new loans. Now, in reality, PIA holds some foreign currency reserves, which shelter it from some of the rupee fluctuations, but accounting standards require that PIA books the exchange difference on the entire amount of US denominated loans. And this line item, called exchange loss, directly impacts the airline's profits for the year. In 2008, this number was equal to about 24 billion rupees. What would have been a modest loss of 12 billion rupees turned into a colossal loss of 36 billion rupees. 20% of its total operating expenses were attributable to the foreign exchange loss. That's a massive portion of the pie. For perspective, salaries and wages were typically representing 12 to 15%. Now, was this 2008 disaster PIA's fault? Not really. I'd argue they were largely the victim of a very difficult operating environment, but I do think they could have been better prepared to weather the storm, by hedging fuel, for example. So without the crazy currency and oil swings in 2009, they were able to narrow their losses, but then from the 2010 to 2015 timeframe, more structural problems began to rear their ugly heads again. First, you had the problem of competitiveness. PIA's attempts to appeal to non-Pakistani travelers hadn't really worked, and because of that, its market share on international routes tanked. In 2005, PIA had about 50% of the international market, which is where it made all its money. 10 years later, in 2015, it had just 20%. Emirates, Qatar, and Etihad were basically stealing all the high-yield international traffic, and PIA got left in the dust. The losses continued, and between the years of 2010 and 2015, PIA was basically on life support. Without government cash infusions, it couldn't pay its employees, it couldn't pay its fuel bills, and it certainly couldn't be bothered to improve the product. Privatization plans were formulated, then fell through again, as any talks of privatization would reliably trigger strikes and operational disruptions that would just make things worse. On the plus side, PIA did start to modernize its short-haul fleet, but its financial situation forced it to do so in a very inefficient way. It couldn't afford to purchase new planes outright, so it turned to rentals, the leasing market, as we call it. Now, the ideal situation is a clean, long-term, dry lease with one or two partners, where you're taking delivery of the plane, you're painting it in your own colors, operating with your own crews, and basically controlling your own destiny. PIA ultimately secured one of these agreements for A320s in 2014, but in the meantime, it had to cobble together a series of wet leases just to plug capacity gaps and maintain its network. For those of you who don't know, wet leases are when the lessor provides the plane, crew, insurance, and maintenance, basically the entire package. It's very convenient, but it's also way more expensive than renting just the plane itself. From 2013 to 2016, PIA leased narrow-body aircraft from companies like Corendon, Pegasus, and Airvia. These planes were newer and more fuel efficient, but they also made things very confusing for PIA's customers because the planes were often not repainted in PIA colors and not actually operated by PIA crew. But in my assessment, it was operationally necessary because PIA just simply didn't have the aircraft to cover its own network. The 737-300s were being withdrawn from service because they were too costly to maintain, and the ATRs were already fully utilized. This fleet management debacle was indicative of the broader cultural and leadership issues at the airline. The MD post was a revolving door of political appointees. I do think many of the appointees were solid candidates, but they just weren't given the time of day to enact the reforms and the agenda they wanted. When Air Chief Marshal Rao Kumar Suleiman resigned in 2012, he was the 7th MD to resign in a period of 8 years. Pretty much all of them complained about excessive political interference. The lack of continuity at the top meant the airline never had a consistent message to its frontline crews and employees on very important matters, such as safety. Various audits by international regulatory bodies found issues with PIA's engineering and maintenance practices, and the airline experienced several close calls in the 2010s, including taxiway collisions, runway excursions, engine fires, and more. The airline narrowly avoided being placed on the EU blacklist. Its aging 747s and A310s were regularly cited for deferred maintenance items and poor cabin conditions. Some of the specific issues included oil leaks, pressurization system faults, and corrosion issues. Even its newer planes weren't getting the care they needed. This became obvious in 2016 when one of PIA's ATRs crashed, resulting in the deaths of everyone on board. The aircraft operating Flight 661 was less than 10 years old, but its engines had developed a series of issues that went unaddressed during normal maintenance. As a result, the plane suffered a catastrophic engine failure during a flight from Chitral to Islamabad that the crew was unable to recover from. Following the crash, PIA had to ground all its ATRs, further exacerbating the capacity issue. And then, of course, public confidence in the airline went down, both at home and abroad. It was pretty bad timing. Just a few months before the crash, PIA had launched a new premium product to try to revive its reputation on long-haul routes. This new venture was called PIA Premier, and it was only available on services to London. London was PIA's biggest international market and a key driver of profitability. Management thought that this service could help the airline regain lost share from British Airways and the Gulf carriers. And everything about this service was elevated, from the plane to the ground experience. The planes were leased A330s from Sri Lankan with more modern interiors and special branding throughout. Crews wore uniforms designed by Nomi Ansari and served individually plated gourmet meals, a step above what you'd find on the airline's aging 777s. Business class passengers received complimentary limousine transfers to and from London Heathrow Airport. It was a well-intentioned plan, but I'd argue it was doomed from the start. The wet lease agreement with Sri Lankan was incredibly expensive, costing the airline approximately $136,000 per round trip from Islamabad to London. PIA launched the service hastily, selling tickets for way less than needed to cover its costs. Despite the low ticket prices, the planes were rarely full, and they were underutilized, sometimes sitting on the ground in the UK or Pakistan for days at a time. As a result, in its first 4 months, the Premier service apparently lost over 2 billion rupees. The service was closed down quietly in April of 2017, and simultaneously, Pakistani regulators launched a probe into the airline for some suspicious deals and shady behavior that had been going on apparently for some time. One of those deals was the usage of an A310 as a movie prop in Malta, and then its subsequent sale to a German museum for just 57,000 euros. The aircraft had been grounded but was supposedly still airworthy and sold without mandatory approval of the board. Now, whether or not proper procedures were followed, I really don't know, but what I do know is that it resulted in the exit of arguably the airline's most interesting CEO of the decade, an ex-Lufthansa executive named Bernd Hildenbrand. Hildenbrand was probably the best chance PIA had to snap out of its bureaucratic trance. He was untangled from local politics and he had experience improving the metrics PIA needed to improve so badly: punctuality, reliability, fleet utilization, and yield management. He actually started as COO in 2016, and his no-nonsense approach drove noticeable results, with PIA increasing its on-time performance to 85% by the end of the year. However, after the whole PIA Premier flop and investigations into corruption, which may or may not have been politically motivated, he left the country and didn't return. And honestly, I don't blame him. His replacement, Musharraf Rasool Cyan, was a Pakistani native and former bureaucrat, but he was a very smart guy, achieving the highest score in the nationwide civil service exam in 1990 and earning his PhD in economics from Georgia State University. Mr. Cyan put forth a thoughtful turnaround plan with the focus on modernizing the brand, technology, and route network. Under his direction, a new logo was introduced featuring a markhor on the tail in place of the Pakistani flag. Now, the flag still took up a pretty good amount of real estate on the front section of the fuselage, but enough people didn't like it that the Supreme Court of Pakistan intervened. The High Court halted PIA from rolling it out, and the one plane that had been repainted had to be stripped of its new identity. Soon the Supreme Court got to Mr. Cyan as well. They ruled that his appointment was made in violation of the carrier's rules and regulations, specifically pointing to his lack of an aviation background and his ties to an advisor of the former prime minister. What a mess. After Cyan's ousting, PIA went back to a more traditional candidate, a former 3-star officer in the Pakistan Air Force, a man named Arshad Malik. Malik had a brief run-in with the high courts, but eventually he had his contract extended in 2020 and served out his second full term until 2022. I believe that makes him the longest-serving head of the airline since Mr. Ahmad Saeed in 2005. However, unfortunately, the fact he wasn't pushed out means he probably didn't do enough to shake up the status quo. PIA's debts, which are about 150 billion rupees when he took office, had more than doubled to 306 billion rupees by the time he left. Though PIA trimmed its losses before COVID, it went right back into a tailspin when the pandemic hit, both financially and operationally. In May of 2020, one of the airline's A320s crashed on approach to Karachi, resulting in 98 fatalities. The resulting investigation found that nearly a third of PIA's pilots had fake licenses. And to clarify, this doesn't necessarily mean that the licenses themselves were fake or that the pilots weren't qualified to fly, just that they had acquired the licenses through potentially fraudulent means, whether by cheating on exams or having others take the exams for them. At any rate, as a result of this scandal, not only were pilots suspended and or fired, but PIA was also banned from flying to the EU, the UK, and the US. These were PIA's most lucrative routes, and their absence cost the airline an estimated 40 billion rupees per year in lost business, equivalent to around $150 million. PIA tried to counter this by doubling down on the Middle East and non-EU countries such as Turkey, but it just wasn't enough. The losses continued, and by 2023, the company had accumulated losses of over 760 billion rupees on its balance sheet. That's around $2.7 billion. PIA sought a bailout of 23 billion rupees, but this was denied as the government was itself on the verge of default. The International Monetary Fund, the IMF, had just injected $3 billion, and there were other priorities besides bankrolling the money pit that was PIA. So without government support, PIA would need the support of the private sector and or foreign investors. Privatization. This process would face many challenges when it was launched in 2024. Initially, only one bid was received at 10 billion rupees, far below the government's minimum threshold of 85 billion. But somewhat miraculously, 1 year later, and PIA has now attracted 4 bids, and it's all systems go to pick a new owner for the airline by next month. Peter, what has changed? Well, the timing was better. The Pakistani currency stabilized after massive inflation in 2023 again hit PIA's bottom line. PIA's safety culture improved, and they got the green light to fly to Europe again. Paris and Manchester flights have resumed, while London and Birmingham are supposedly coming soon. And investors got to see what PIA could do without a massive debt burden. You see, as part of the privatization, the government agreed to take on about 3/4 of PIA's legacy debts. So in 2024, about 300 billion rupees of long-term debt disappeared from the balance sheet. Interest payments went down about 85%. And the company reported its first profit in nearly 2 decades. Now, of course, the debt just didn't magically disappear. The government will still have to pay back PIA's lenders, which will ultimately still burden Pakistani taxpayers. But I'd argue it was a necessary evil if they wanted any chance at saving the airline and its roughly 6,500 employees. And in my view, it's certainly an airline worth saving. PIA was once an airline the Pakistani people were proud of. And despite its failures over the past few decades, it still has so much potential. It's still the market leader with about 1/4 of international flights. It has air service agreements with 97 countries and almost 180 valuable slot pairs in foreign markets. And of course, the people and equipment to make things happen. It just needs the right leadership and the right investment. Just like that, our PIA series is over. At least for now. I always think I'm being concise, and then I look back and I see that it took me 75 minutes to get through it all. But hope you enjoyed the deep dive. Thanks for your patience, And as always, keep the PIA stories coming in the comments below. Before I go, I did want to give a special shout out to History of PIA for all the tremendous content they've assembled on the history of the airline. Without them, I don't think this series would have been possible. So thank you guys for all the work you've done to document PIA's fascinating history. More airline stories will be coming your way soon, but in the meantime, I wish you the safest and happiest of travels wherever your journeys may take you. So long.